Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Michael O'Reilly, who was an FCC commissioner from 2013 to 2020, recently came out with a op-ed in National Review and his feelings on the new net neutrality regulations. Be right back and we'll take a look at that. And thanks for joining me, Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So I want to take a look at this article. This is in the National Review, which, up front, this is a conservative-leaning publication. A lot of people would call it right-wing or extreme right or something like that. It's not. This is a conservative publication, but Michael O'Reilly, a Republican commissioner who was on the commission from 2013 to 2020, just wrote this, and I thought we'd take a look at it to look at the kind of the other side of the argument that the FCC would be making. The FCC, just to kind of bring up to speed, is wanting to re-implement the net neutrality regulations that were put in place under the Obama administration and then were removed during the Trump administration. They are wanting to basically redo that, which would be reclassifying broadband as a Title II service under the Telecommunications Act of 1936, as opposed to, let's say, an information service. And he makes some really good points in here. And again, full disclosure, I'm a conservative, so I kind of agree with a lot of what he says. Although I came to these conclusions on my own. It's not like I'm following some party line. I mean, I've been saying this for years, well before they ever implemented the regulations in the first place. I've been saying that net neutrality regulations were basically a solution in search of a problem. And I think I said that first way back when. So I thought I'd read through this and just kind of give you another opinion here from, again, this is a former commissioner to the FCC. So you see here, he says, the FCC's net neutrality plan is unjustified and harmful. And again, this is in the National Review. You see down here, I've got one article left. This is the first one I pulled up this month, I think. I'm not subscribed to this, but I think I put a link in the description, so I think you can still get to it and read it. I think the site does require a subscription, and I think it might be a paid subscription. But again, I was able to get and read this one article. So you see here, FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel right there. So she's pushing for these new regulations with the current FCC. They've met on that and have kind of outlined what they want to do, and this is in response to that. So he says here, the last thing the internet needs is self-anointed regulatory saviors swooping in to fix what isn't broken using the crude tools of a bygone era. So he's talking there about the fact that there doesn't seem to be a problem right now that we're trying to fix. And then secondly, we're trying to fix it with regulations or legislation back from 1936 when the telephone service was barely available. Now we're talking about broadband service. So when the FCC voted in 2017 to end its 2-year repressive effort to regulate broadband providers under 1930s era Title II utility laws, critics on the left loudly predicted that the internet would collapse into a dystopian hellscape of blocking and throttling, slower internet speeds, jacked up prices, and the death of streaming video. And a lot of what he's going to say here sounds kind of, again, you're reading it and he's going to use terminology that you might not agree with. But I mean, really what he's saying here is true. And this did not do, in my opinion, the case for net neutrality it did not help the case for net neutrality that when the regulations were pulled, they made it sound like it was going to be the end of the world. Because there weren't problems with net neutrality prior to the regulations. So why would there be huge problems afterward? But they made it sound like it was going to be the end of the world. And it really motivated a lot of people out there, a lot of activists to go out and really push for new regulations when there wasn't a problem. And all of this didn't take place. It's been 5 years now, and none of these dire predictions have happened. So you can click on those links, and I didn't bother doing that, but I'm sure it goes to, basically some of the opinions that were put out at that point by folks on the other side that were saying it was going to be the end of the internet as we knew it. From that moment forward, reinstating Title II became a rallying cry, if not an article of faith, for some advocacy groups and policymakers. No one should be surprised, then, that the Commission recently announced, within hours of Democrats regaining a majority at the agency, that it would move swiftly to once again browbeat and micromanage broadband providers via Title II. So again, you hear the language that's coming from somebody on the other side of the argument. The only real suspense was over how the FCC might conceivably justify the reversal, considering that every apocalyptic prediction that net neutrality activists made after 2017 turned out to be pure gibberish. Since my fellow Republican commissioners and I allegedly ended the internet in 2017, average internet speeds in the U.S. have more than tripled. Competition is surging thanks to record-breaking private investment between competing technologies. Consumer prices for internet services have fallen relative to inflation. Streaming services have continued their ascent, and our resilient, robust networks kept America's economy afloat, providing connectivity to communicate, work, educate, shop, entertain, and so much more during the global COVID pandemic. And that's true. During the pandemic, internet service providers stepped up with their current networks and did what they could immediately to try to increase speeds and reliability, especially in the upstream, as that was something that was new. Nobody was anticipating the growth in the upstream traffic that we saw based on trends. But you get a pandemic in there, and that changes reality. So they were able to address that if they could. Now, there's certain technologies that were not able to address that, like DSL. They could not make the kind of changes. But if you had a cable network, obviously that was able to make some changes. Obviously, fiber was not an issue. And it did make us realize that, we need to get better broadband everywhere in case this happens again, or just in general for folks, so that they can do what they need to do, whether it's business or entertainment at home. So, that was one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic, was realizing that we needed to improve the broadband service. And that has been happening despite, not having network or net neutrality regulations in place. So he says here, so after the left's previous parade of horribles proved to be pure fiction, what possible cause could the commission make for swinging one of its heaviest regulatory sledgehammers at a broadband marketplace that by any conceivable measure is thriving? Not much of a case at all, it turns out. The proposed rulemaking the commission kicked off last Thursday claims that this regulatory power grab is needed to protect national security and public safety and to advance rural broadband deployment. None of these arguments holds up to scrutiny. The draft rule claims that the FCC needs Title II authority to prevent hostile foreign state-owned companies from operating broadband services in the U.S. Beyond the fact that this has nothing to do with net neutrality, it's also flat out false. And that's true. A lot of what they're saying they need the net neutrality regulations for are really not related to net neutrality. So it's kind of saying we need this power, but if it's not related to net neutrality, then you look at that, doing that some other way, or call it something different. The commission has leaned on its Title II authority to kick 3 Chinese telecom providers out of the U.S. market in recent years, but only because it had previously granted those companies authority to offer Title II services. That's a far cry from the FCC's argument that it cannot adequately secure broadband networks without a massive expansion of its regulatory scope. Indeed, the Commission already has numerous tools at its disposal to address national security threats posed by foreign firms, including the equipment authorization process that Congress recently strengthened. Just ask whether Huawei, whose network equipment the FCC blacklisted for the U.S. use in 2019, found the Commission powerless. Besides, even if the Commission's existing authority were deemed insufficient for safeguarding national security, highly unlikely in my view, other agencies and departments of the federal government's Team Telecom have loads to spare. In other words, lots of other agencies. There's the FTC that can get involved in various things. There's other agencies. Of course, there's FBI. There's other agencies that can get involved if there are national security issues. The FCC's claims that Title II is necessary to protect public safety are equally empty. The FCC already requires broadband providers to comply with the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, also known as CALEA. Is it implying that this longstanding FCC policy is unlawful? CALEA is it's an unfunded mandate that was put in place back when we realized that we could not really track certain kinds of traffic or conversations. So, the FBI had the ability to go in and get wiretaps on phone calls when we had the old analog kinds of switches. You just plug in a few wires and do this, a pen tap or trace, whatever it was. You could listen to a phone call and you could hear the content. But with the advent of broadband service and voice over IP, we suddenly realized if we had, kind of terrorist kinds of situations we need to listen into, or other national security things, that we didn't have the ability to do that. So CALEA was brought about to make that happen, making the equipment, the new digital switches compatible, broadband networks compatible, where you can actually, in a sense, put a live feed of broadband communications back and forth between a specific person. It's not something you do wholesale, but you've got to have a court order basically to do that kind of thing, whether it was a phone conversation or a CALEA request for broadband. So CALEA was put in place, again, unfunded mandate that required all broadband operators basically to have in place where they could assist the FBI with these live intercepts of broadband service, and the same thing on voice over IP. And every internet service provider needs to do that, and it's something that was implemented without net neutrality or any other regulations. And by the way, quick note, quick promotion here, if you're a broadband provider, you need to have CALEA in place. If you don't have it in place, there's up to a $10,000 fine per day if the FBI comes knocking on your door and needs a live intercept and you can't provide it. So I'll put my contact information up here right now because, again, this is very important. And a lot of broadband operators don't know about this because they're maybe new to the business, or when it all came out, they maybe ignored it. And if you're new to the business, you need to be aware of it. If you ignored it, you need to be aware of it, because one change that was made recently is the FCC now is starting to make broadband operators file their security systems and integrity plans, which is a CALEA plan that you have to file. They're making them file online now. In the past, you just had your plan, you sent it in, and that was it. But now it's all being filed online, so it's going to be easier for the FCC to kind of check on internet service providers and seeing if they've got their plans in place, and something you need to do. So just be aware of that. I want to make that point. So his point here is CALEA was implemented, and or is the FCC saying that they didn't have the authority to do that, because certainly it's been in place now for years, at least over 10. So the most absurd of the Commission's new ever-shifting arguments for Title II is a claim that it needs this new authority to promote rural broadband deployment. No policymaker can suggest with a straight face that saddling broadband networks with new regulatory burdens and compliance costs, especially the ever-present risk of future price regulation and the Kafkaesque requirement to comply with an undefined and amorphous general conduct standard, would lead providers to invest more in an already risky rural build-out project. So it's true that if your goal is to try to improve broadband deployment, and especially broadband deployment maybe by smaller operators that regulations are going to hit them even harder, to try to, on top of that goal, then add new regulations is counter to what you're trying to accomplish with that goal. So. And there's no reason that net neutrality itself would impact, not having the regulations in place would impact rural broadband service. I don't understand the connection there. There's not a connection there. Why that would be a situation where not having the regulations would impact negatively rural broadband, but having the regulations would negatively impact rural broadband. Clearly, the opposite is exactly the case. Increasing the uncertainty and risk in network builders' financial models will only decrease their appetite to invest, particularly in markets where American families have no broadband service at all. The draft rule even has the gall to cite the massive $65 billion commitment to universal broadband that Congress made in the 2021 infrastructure bill as a reason for why the FCC needs expanded authority, while conveniently ignoring that Congress expressly chose not to reclassify broadband as a common carrier in that legislation. So that's an important point, in that, my argument and the argument of lots of others would be that agencies should not be interpreting legislation on their own. If it's not clear in the legislation, then it needs to go back to Congress. And the Supreme Court recently, as I've talked about in a couple of recent broadcasts about net neutrality, the Supreme Court recently has been moving in that direction, where it's saying that if it's a major question, then and it's not covered in the legislation, then really the courts and the agency do not have the ability to determine the answer to that question or to do new rules. It needs to go back to Congress, and they need to clarify things. So that's what he's saying there. In fact, Congress has never so much as hinted in any statute that the FCC should reclassify broadband as a Title II common carrier. That's the main reason why most legal experts, including two of the Obama administration's top legal minds, agree the FCC's latest proposal would likely be dead on arrival at the Supreme Court. And I did a broadcast about that recently, and I went through the arguments of those two Obama administration officials, which were about something called Chevron deference, which I explained in there, as well as this major questions doctrine, which the Supreme Court has been leaning towards, that would make it very likely that they would overturn this if the FCC did spend their time trying to get these regulations in place. And there's actually a court case coming up that I talked about, again, a week or two ago, that will further solidify this major questions doctrine and the Chevron deference, really specifically that, toward the fact that agencies, again, they need to be limited in their scope because they're unelected officials. So they need to be limited in the amount of rules and regulations they can put on. If it's not clearly part of the legislation, they can't be interpreting that widely. And I would be very surprised if the Supreme Court did not take up the case if the FCC does move forward with this. Or it's very possible that when the FCC looks at whatever ruling comes out in this upcoming case, that they determine maybe they don't want to move forward. But the point is, and the two Obama officials said this as well, is that it's really a waste of time. It's a waste of time and energy for the FCC to be doing this because, as they say here, it would be dead on arrival at the Supreme Court if it gets there. Wasting months of FCC staff, resources, and years of subsequent legal cost defending a regulatory rule likely to lose in court is troublesome. But pushing ahead anyway when the FCC can't find a credible reason why the rules are even necessary is mind-blowingly absurd. Last thing the internet needs is self-anointed regulatory saviors swooping in to fix what isn't broken using the crude tools of a bygone era. And again, the crude tools of a bygone era, that's talking about the fact that the legislation that they are looking at is the Title II regulations from 1936, so well before internet. And even when we had internet and the rules were, the Communications Act was kind of amended in I think it was 1996. Specifically, in that legislation, it classifies broadband service as information service and telephone service as telecommunications service. So there was a dichotomy there that they added when they added the internet. So the legislation, if anything, you could not interpret it to say, okay, we're going to take this thing that was classified in legislation as information service and now make it part of Title II, that they would be telecom carriers, basically. So again, that would be just one more reason that I think the Supreme Court would look at it and go, no, it's not covered in the legislation. And if anybody's going to fix this, it would be Congress. And Congress would get involved, certainly, I think, if there was a problem. So that is really the crux of it, is have we had a problem? There were little things that were happening prior to the net neutrality rules going into place by the Obama administration, and they were all handled. They were handled under the FCC's current authority. And then when the Trump administration, then the Obama administration went ahead and implemented the net neutrality, nothing changed before and after, before implementation, after implementation. Then the Trump administration removed them. And when they were removed, the Trump administration said, this doesn't mean broadband operators get a free pass. What we're saying is that we will still make sure that you're behaving yourselves. And if the FCC does not have regulatory authority, it will be handled. The FCC will make recommendations, and then the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, will be the hammer that will come down and enforce whatever the FCC needs to be enforced. So there was something in place to continue to make sure that broadband operators behaved. So no change again before and after. Before the rules were repealed, after the rules were repealed, no change. Everything went on, didn't have all of the apocalyptic kind of stuff happening. And here we are today, and they're wanting to re-implement it again. And again, it's not likely to work because of the fact that the courts more and more are looking at the federal agencies as being, as having limited scope of powers, limited to whatever is in the regulations. They, again, being unelected regulatory groups, they are not supposed to be making rules that are not part of the legislation. And it's certainly not part of the legislation in this case with the Telecom Act. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it. If you are not subscribed to our channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button, ring the bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live. If you like this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.